We're beginning Chapter 16, Rudi the Crook. Since Terror Flight School owner Rudi Deckers was not in any regular sense a businessman, we began to entertain slightly darker scenarios for what he was doing and how he just happened to be in such close proximity to Mohomed Atta's terrorist cadre. Deckers repeatedly evidenced lack of interest in running the business side of Huffman Aviation, the Venice FBO, the bread and butter of the operation, and this fact was noted by the Venice aviation community. People with helicopters at FBOs are generally looking to defray their expenses by renting out things like helicopters. That's what they're in business for, explained Danny Schultz, who's been flying for 15 years in the skies over Southwest Florida. He said he's puzzled at the lack of interest shown by Deckers in his nominal business. I needed to rent a helicopter for a property appraisal a while back, he continued, citing an example. I called his, Deckers, office several days in advance because he was the local chopper supplier. He's got the FBO in Venice. And they told me he would call me back. It was a sizable usage of the chopper, which would be very financially rewarding. But he never got back to me. He didn't even give me the courtesy of a reply. All I can say is that, at the time, I thought it was odd, stated Schultz, shaking his head. And this was long before Rudi Deckers became famous after 9/11. Whatever Rudi Deckers was about, it wasn't about making a buck in general aviation. Longtime local pilot Schultz described abrupt changes in the aviation scene once Deckers took over at Huffman. We have a designated flight examiner at our small airport. He was one of the few in this area, explained Schultz. He stayed busy most of the time with foreign students, giving them their FAA check rides. I often went to lunch with him, and these folks would come too, and some of them could hardly speak English. They were from places like Libya, various countries in the Middle East. It hadn't always been that way in Southwest Florida. It was a recent influx of this type of trainee, said Schultz, and that's why understanding the true identity of the Dutch national who in 1999 purchased Huffman Aviation is so important. Rudi Deckers was responsible for the flood of Arab student pilots that began marching across the tarmac. Mohomed Atta and his Hamburg cadre were part of that flood. So, who is Rudi Deckers? We interviewed a number of people who worked with or for Deckers in the last few years. They were unanimous in the opinion that Deckers is a highly dubious character. Danielle Clark has observed Deckers close up at the Naples airport since the early 1990s. Born in Lyons, France, she was passionate about flying since girlhood. She moved to Naples, Florida a decade ago, after a long marriage to an English flight instructor during which they taught flying in Britain. When he died, she told us it was time for a change of scene, and Florida had a reputation as a sunny place. Rudi was a wheeler dealer back to the 1990. Rudi was a wheeler dealer back to 1990 in Naples, she recalled. First time I saw him, I said to myself, there's a crook. Never get associated with him. He'll be bankrupt before the end of the year. Then, after I'd seen him for a while, I'd say to myself, there goes Rudi the Crook. Danielle was a shrewd judge of human nature, apparently, because Rudi is a crook. He's wanted in his native country. We learned from a law enforcement source in Venice that after Dutch authorities recognized him during his many appearances on CNN, he was re-indicted on financial charges in the Netherlands. The cop credited Larry King Live with performing a function usually reserved for America's Most Wanted. Even in the U.S., ordinarily such a friendly and forgiving place for him, Deckers' legal troubles were mounting. By the end of 2002, he had also been indicted on a charge of criminal fraud by the state of Florida. When we called Deckers for comment on his indictment, he professed to be unaware of any pending charges. My lawyer in the Netherlands has said nothing to me about any indictment, he said. I can't imagine that I could have done anything wrong. The Florida state's attorney was telling a different story. Deckers owes $3 million to the government of the Netherlands. From the mid-1990s, we discovered, stated Florida state's attorney Jonathan Green, leading the prosecution of Deckers in Sarasota. Deckers owned $3 million Deckers owed $3 million in the Netherlands as the result of pledging assets he didn't own to secure loans he had no intentions of repaying, the same crime for which he'd just been charged in Florida. After a judge in Sarasota signed a warrant for Deckers' arrest, the local gondolier called him for a comment. Deckers said, "Wow, I'm surprised." Florida state's attorney, Green, sounded faintly amused at the intrigue swirling around Deckers. I knew nothing about Rudi Deckers except the particulars of this one charge, but I've learned more, he said, figuratively rolling his eyes. I've gotten at least 15 to 20 calls, for example, just to congratulate me for charging him. There was also a federal investigation alleging illegal exportation of technology against him a while back, Green told us. They're working on some federal stuff on him now. This confirmed a big piece of the Rudi Deckers puzzle we'd been hearing from numerous sources, that Deckers had been the subject of a multi-agency federal investigation in the mid-90s, an investigation in which several federal agencies' pool resources must have indicated some strong federal interest in Rudi Deckers' activities. John Velada, the tanned and smiling son of an expatriate Cuban family who came to America in the early 60s, knew Deckers when he was exciting all that federal attention. He was also, until recently, the jet manager for Wally Hillard's fleet of planes. There was a warrant for Rudi Deckers' arrest for smuggling computer chips. Both the DEA and U.S. Customs were interested in him back in 93 and 94, he said. What I heard was that he was buying the chips, taking boxes, and putting a certain amount of chips in, and then hiding the rest underneath to evade customs. He has a warrant in Holland for smuggling in chips, Velada said. He's not allowed back in Holland. He got busted for smuggling chips and money fraud. I remember when DEA, Customs, everyone was after him over here. To have aroused interest in the Drug Enforcement Administration, Deckers must have been involved with smuggling something besides computer chips. Why was the DEA interested in Rudi? Nobody ever knew. That was the big question, Velada replied. All I know is the DEA was here. U.S. Customs, Holland officials. That's when I learned he had to flee Holland. We had confirmation from Florida State Attorney Jonathan Green that it was true. Deckers had been under suspicion of illegal exportation of high technology, Green had said. So a man wanted in his home country and also the target of a multi-agency federal investigation was invited to testify in front of Congress of the United States of America, where he was free with tips on preventing future terrorist attacks. How was this possible? Even more importantly, after the 9/11 attack, after Rudi Deckers had been seemingly instantly relieved of suspicion, No journalist inquired about whether he had been engaging in illegal activity at the same time the terrorist conspiracy was making use of his facilities. We called the Netherlands Embassy, Washington, D.C. Was it true Deckers was a wanted man in Holland? We don't give this information out to journalists, explained embassy spokesman Harry DeWitt, who nonetheless said, You can make what you will of the fact that I am referring you to the Ministry of Justice for an explanation. I've been told to say nothing. The man at Huffman Aviation standing in front of the TV cameras, Rudi Deckers, was a linchpin in the official story. His testimony has shaped the initial accounts of the hijackers. Why had Deckers been anointed? Why had Deckers been anointed designated interviewee? Didn't the U.S. know Deckers was a crook before he went on television? There is only one answer, we think. Rudi Deckers was one of their own, or he belonged to them at least. He said what they wanted him to say because he had to. He was a criminal. He had been caught by federal authorities back in the mid-90s, but he had never been charged. Why not? The answer is simple and yet stunning. Rudi Deckers had rolled and become a government confidential informant. He was, in criminal parlance, working off a beef. In the dozens of sound bites he fed the world's media about Atta and Marwan in the days after the attack, he lied and lied, effectively, for the people for whom he worked. They even coached him on what to say. This explains how two Dutch nationals, Kruithof and Deckers, could each buy flight training schools at the off-beaten-track Venice airport and not face questioning about it later when 3 of their students are found to be piloting planes used as guided missiles on a September morning. There were people taken into federal custody whose connections with the terrorists were far less suspicious than theirs. Plus, both men were foreign nationals, presumed to be flight risks as a matter of law, yet neither was being held. While dozens of journalists milled aimlessly at Huffman Aviation in the frenzied days after the attack, only one noted that Deckers' story kept changing. Reporter Rochelle Reinford expressed her suspicions about Deckers on September 29, 2001, in the Sarasota Weekly Planet. It would be reasonable to expect Deckers to give the same information to every news outlet, she stated. Perhaps, but that was not the case. When Deckers first appeared before the press on the day after the attack, this is what he said. He didn't know the suspects. He wasn't the one who took their money, so he was unsure of how they paid for their training. He didn't see their passports, so he wasn't sure where they were from. He denied having any interactions with them at all. On Wednesday, he told some reporters, including me, that his interaction with the 2 suspects came from a couple of brief conversations when he passed them in the halls, Reinford wrote. His employees had dealt with their enrollment. But by Sunday's reports, Deckers was serving up anecdotes about the 2 men, telling one reporter he sat there the last year when he came to talk to me about taking lessons here. According to Reinford, on the day after the attack, a reporter from the New York Times asked Deckers about reports that the 2 men, Atta and al-Shehi, were from Germany. Didn't it strike you as odd that they were from Germany? They didn't look German, did they? Don't tell me what people tell you, Deckers barked in response. I have never heard that they're from Germany. I have never heard that they speak German, Reinford wrote. Deckers gave a different answer on Larry King Live. Now, he did know No, he did know. Now he did know where they were from. Deckers now recalled that Atta told him he had come from Germany, but when Deckers, a Dutch native, began speaking to Atta in German, the Middle Eastern man just got up and walked out of his office. Deckers said he found it odd. Whereas on Wednesday, he blasted a reporter for asking about a German connection, wrote Reinford. On Thursday, he told me an anecdote about one of the suspects saying he was German. Deckers wasn't just remembering new details, she concluded. He was learning how to tell a story. Because national reporters apparently had no clue about his shady local reputation and his inability for 6 months straight to pay his rent on time. No one questioned how Deckers had come to be so flush with cash just 3 weeks before the attack. But it did strike some people as strange, like Bill Warner, a private investigator in Sarasota who made his business to delve into Rudi Deckers' financial affairs to explain his sudden pre-9/11 change in liquidity. 9/11 somehow came up with $10,000 in late October 2001, he told us, to finally pay off the woman's, Nicole Antini, sexual harassment suit. He also came up with $56,000 in early November to pay off another lawsuit with FH 1100 Manufacturing Corp. But he had filed a UCC with M&I Bank Northeast for all inventory of Huffman Aviation way back in March of 2000. So he appears to have had no source of additional financing for this $65,000 cash outlay in late October and early November 2001. There are enough judgments in his name and his company's name to paper his office walls, said Werner. How do you obtain that much cash under such severe conditions? If somebody had been protecting Rudi Deckers from financial harm, all that changed with the INS thing 6 months after 9/11, said airport insider Max Berg. Rudi got indicted because he embarrassed the President of the United States with the INS bullshit. The INS bullshit refers to Rudi Deckers' return to the national stage exactly 6 months to the day after the attack. He'd gotten a second 15 minutes of fame and made headlines again when he called in reporters to reveal a government bungle when he received in the mail on the 6-month anniversary of the attack INS approval of visas for Mohomed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi. It had been a very bad day for the INS. In addition to provoking outrage on Capitol Hill, the hapless INS's bungling was said to have made even President George W. Bush pretty hot. The CIA and FBI had been taking all the post-9/11 heat, but suddenly the tide of public opinion turned against the lowly INS, and a finger of blame began to be pointed towards what was, no doubt, a swell bunch of guys forced to spend their time standing around in the hot sun at border crossings, doing their best to look the other way. It didn't seem fair. Deckers displayed the INS letter to reporters. He said the arrival of the yellow INS forms had come as a shock. We thought we had put this behind us, he said, and it had to happen right on the 6-month anniversary. Poor Rudi caught the public relations break of the news century. The cameras were rolling again, and he was back in the limelight, jetting to Washington, D.C., this time to advise the INS and on how they might improve their system. Even the New York Times raised an eyebrow. The error seemed particularly difficult to explain, because Mr. Atta and Mr. al-Shehi were among the most infamous of the 9/11 hijackers, said the Times. It was a triumphant performance for Deckers, who said he viewed the INS mistake as long-sought vindication. He told reporters, When they hit the buildings, they were approved to be here. I could not show until now that we applied for the right paperwork. Therefore, I am happy I can do that now. A reporter asked, "So you feel vindicated?" "Yes," Deckers replied. "I don't expect when I get in on Monday morning to get 2 permits for Atta and Al-Shahi. I thought they were behind me already, and my life goes on." When we saw him speak these words on camera, we thought, "Not so fast, pal." He was clearly enjoying the moment, however, and dispensed some advice to the American government. The flight schools didn't do anything wrong. The government needs to look at itself and look at procedures and see what they can change so this will not happen again. Deckers at that point seemed to need some kind of turnaround in his fortunes to alleviate all the bad publicity he had been getting locally. A gondolier editorial even suggested for the first time that it might be time for Deckers to go. He won't be more helpful. The city should re-examine whether it wants Deckers' business to remain at the airport, said the editorial. When we originally asked people in Venice how they had felt on learning the news that the terrorist pilots had trained right in their town, a woman in a deli of a Publix market echoed widespread community sentiment when she told us they wanted to go burn down the airport. So slipping quietly out of town would have seemed the outcome the Dutch national would be desperately seeking. But Deckers called attention to himself just when he should have been laying low. And now the President of the United States himself was pissed. Certainly no one enjoys being left hanging, twisting slowly in the wind. We remembered that budding screenwriters are taught that sometimes the best thing that could possibly happen to your character turns out to be the worst thing. But that's the way life is. Rudi's second moment in the headlines would come back to haunt him. Aviation consultant Max Berg told us he hasn't been protected for at least a month. It was a measure of revenge for Berg. Rudi and Max had crossed swords in an aviation deal. Deckers had looked at him, Max said, and sneered. "You're not a player." Now Max Berg was returning the favor, he said proudly. "I made sure that the indictment developed. I made sure Wally had the right attorney." The first time we met him, Max Berg had identified himself as a business consultant for the American government. He was a square-jawed, no-nonsense former Marines and riverboat pilot from Mississippi in Venice to broker a sale of Huffman Aviation to new owners. It appeared he might be playing an official role at the Venice airport, a position that might, in hindsight, have been filled a little sooner. Max had had business at the Venice airport with some of the players involved, he told us. So after 9/11, he had checked with some people to ascertain if any of his business associates at the airport had any culpability in the attack. "I was told that Rudi doesn't check out clear," he said. "When I asked about Deckers, I was told he's bigger than national, he's transnational, and I was warned to stay away from him." Something had now changed, apparently, because Berg was talking about Deckers. In the drive to indict Rudi, he told us, smiling, virtually every branch of the U.S. government lent a helping hand. Everybody offered to help in any way they could. The INS was especially helpful. "I hear Rudi owes $5.5 million to Wally," he tossed out casually. "I hear Rudi's helicopters has a stolen government engine in it." His indictment opens up Pandora's box, Berg concluded. "If he runs, you'll have it. It's also about getting a hold of him, and it opens up a big can of worms." We couldn't believe it. There it was, the can of worms we'd been waiting for. Berg made a prediction. If he doesn't flee, he'll be arrested in the next couple of weeks. He was. When Rudi Deckers tried to use the INS snafu to his public relations advantage, even as he was claiming to feel vindicated, new details were being released that showed he was nothing of the kind. Rudi shares the new famous INS form with the Associated Press, which noted that on the visa application, Atta's name is misspelled Mohomed. It was an understandable mistake since the Huffman aviation assistant who filled them out, 18-year-old Nicole Antini, was just then being sexually harassed by a middle-aged Dutch boot. We saw something else important. The AP, that the INS documents indicated the academic term cost each of the two terrorist pilots $27,300. This was now the third and highest figure that had come out, since somehow the exact amount Deckers charged the terrorists was one of those things that never gets pinned down. Deckers had changed his story twice, and now it was revealed that Atta and al-Shahi had paid nearly $30,000 each, almost $60,000 between them. Deckers had been quoted in numerous places saying that between his two schools, he'd been training 500 foreign nationals a year, and 500 times $30,000 is a fairly significant seven-figure number. So how come, out at the Venice airport, Deckers had been unable to pay his rent? It was clear that Rudi Deckers was more than an innocent business owner, victimized by wily terrorists. There was a darker reality lurking behind his widely promoted public persona. For example, we learned to our amazement that at the same time, Deckers had been unable to pay Huffman Aviation's rent for 6 months in a row. He had been launching an airline. We weren't the only ones taken aback at this development. There had been amazement at the Venice airport as well. When we heard that Hillard and Deckers were starting an airline in early 2001, everybody at the airport's jaw dropped, Coy Jacobs told us. When someone walked in my office and told me Deckers was starting an airline, I told him, sure, I'm building a shuttle facility here at Venice Airport. That's how ridiculous it was. Yet we found a glowing pay-in to Deckers' business acumen in the Sarasota Herald Tribune article on Rudi's new airline called Florida Air, or Flair. Run by an ambitious, optimistic, fast-talking Dutch citizen named Rudi Deckers. The airline, using 11-seat Cessna Grand Caravans it borrowed from Alaska Air subsidiary Harbor Air, opened for business February 15th. By March, it added Jacksonville to its route list. And if the airline catches on with Florida travelers, it might expand to other cities, including Pensacola, Atlanta, and Savannah, Georgia. And right about then was when we learned that Deckers' partner in his new airline was in business with the mob. That's it for today. Chapter 17, Secretary's Day tomorrow.